God's warning, Donald Trump prophecy, prophetic word 2025, final warning from God, urgent prophetic message, Trump prophetic vision, and spiritual leadership message, intercession for leaders, America prophecy, divine alignment, kingdom purpose, Trump destiny, end time prophecy, spiritual climate shift, prophetic teaching, God's mercy and judgment, humility and leadership, repentance message, prophetic gate, destiny of nations. Gentlemen, eternal warning, kingdom over politics, watchmen rise, intercessors called divine protection, lifting of God's shield, public humbling prophecy, destiny crossroads, spiritual authority, prophetic urgency, leaders and nations, prophetic guidance, Trump's spiritual role, nations in prophecy, prophetic assignments, divine restoration, purpose delay warning, prophetic clarity, urgent word for leaders, spiritual consequences, prophetic counsel. When God visits a person, a family, a city, or a nation, it is never random, casual, or without direction. His visitation is always deliberate, carrying within it a clear assignment and a predetermined outcome. Heaven does not operate on guesswork. Before he shows up in a situation, he has already concluded what he wants to accomplish. This is why when God moves, the results are undeniable and the atmosphere shifts to align with his will. In the scriptures, every visitation of God was loaded with purpose. When he came to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, it was not just to share a meal, but to announce the fulfillment of a promise and to set in motion the birth of a nation. Gentlemen, when he appeared to Moses in the burning bush, it was not merely to give him a supernatural encounter, but to commission him as a deliverer for Israel. Divine visitation is not sightseeing. It is heaven stepping into time to alter the course of events according to a divine agenda. God's visitation often comes in response to a cry, covenant or prophetic time frame that has reached maturity. He visited Israel in Egypt after 430 years because the time appointed for their deliverance had come. Gentlemen, he visited Hannah in Shiloh because the prophetic moment for her womb to be opened had arrived. This means that when God comes, he is not coming to watch the chaos of your life or to observe the weight of your pain. He is coming with the intent to act, to change, to heal, and gentlemen, to restore and to set in order what has been broken. His presence is always a signal that change is at hand. He is the God who never arrives empty-handed. When he steps in, he carries light for darkness, strength for weakness, direction for confusion, and solutions for impossible situations. The intentionality of God's visitation also means that nothing in your life is hidden from him. And gentlemen, he does not need to be informed about your struggles or updated on your condition. He knows the root causes, the hidden factors, and the unseen battles you face. And because he knows, he also comes with precision. He will not apply a general solution to a specific problem. Gentlemen, just as a skilled physician diagnoses before prescribing, God assesses with perfect knowledge before releasing his answer. Gentlemen, when he came to the pool of Bethesda, he did not heal everyone at once. He walked to the man who had been there 38 years, knowing that this was his moment of transformation. When Jesus visited Zacchaeus' house, it was not just to share fellowship. Gentlemen, it was to bring salvation to that household. Every time God visits, something shifts in alignment, his specific purpose for that moment. Many times, divine visitation comes after a season of preparation or testing. God will often align circumstances to ensure that when he comes, man, you are positioned to receive what he brings. Joseph had to endure years in prison so that when God visited, gentlemen, it would be the exact moment Pharaoh needed an interpreter for his dream, catapulting Joseph from the dungeon to the palace. The intentional nature of God's visitation means he weaves together timing, location, and readiness so that nothing is wasted. Even delays are not arbitrary. They are strategic pauses to ensure that when the answer comes, it cannot be sabotaged or prematurely aborted. It is also important to understand that God's visitation may not always look dramatic to the human eye. Sometimes it comes through a still, small voice, a divine connection, an unexpected opportunity, or a gentle stirring in your spirit. Other times is marked by visible signs, miracles, and undeniable interventions. But whether subtle or spectacular, his arrival carries the same power and purpose. Man, the key is to be spiritually alert so that you do not miss the day of your visitation. The Bible warns that it is possible to be so distracted or hardened that God can be in your midst and you fail to recognize him. Jerusalem missed her moment of peace because she did not know the time of her visitation. This is why discernment is crucial. When God visits, he does not merely treat symptoms, he addresses roots. If you are in debt, he will not only give you temporary relief, but also break the cycle that created the debt. If you are bound by fear, gentlemen, he will not only comfort you, but also dismantle the lies that have kept you enslaved. His solutions are complete, leaving no room for the problem to return with the same force. The Israelites did not just leave Egypt. The power of Pharaoh over them was broken forever. And gentlemen, this is what happens when God visits intentionally. He brings lasting change that bears the seal of heaven. The assurance that God's visitation is intentional fuel your faith. And gentlemen, you are not forgotten and your prayers are not ignored. The God who sees, hears, and knows is also the God who comes down to deliver. He came down in Egypt. He came down in the fiery furnace with the 3 Hebrew boys, and he will come down into your situation. Gentlemen, his footsteps in your life will leave traces of mercy, power, and restoration. When he comes, chains will break, burdens will lift, and paths will open where there were none. Nothing can resist his presence, because his visit is not for observation. It is for intervention, transformation, and fulfillment of his word. When God chooses to answer a situation, his methods are not bound by the limitations of human reasoning or the constraints of natural laws. He is the creator of all things, gentlemen, and the systems we consider unchangeable are subject to his command. This is why his solutions often appear illogical, unconventional, gentle, and even impossible to the natural mind. What makes sense to God may appear foolish to men, yet the seeming foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. When he parted the Red Sea for the Israelites, it was not a humanly conceived escape plan. No military strategy or engineering design could have achieved it. It was a supernatural intervention that ignored the laws of physics and proved that when God acts, nature itself becomes a servant to his purpose. And gentlemen, in the wilderness, when the people thirsted, he brought water out of a rock, not from a river, not from a well, but from a source considered lifeless. These acts reveal a pattern. Man, God delights in demonstrating that his ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. Human logic is built on observation, gentlemen, patterns and predictability. We expect solutions to follow certain paths, and we measure possibility by past experiences or known principles. But God is not confined to these boundaries. He may choose to heal someone instantly without medicine, while another receives healing gradually through treatment. He may provide for a family through an unexpected financial breakthrough, while another finds their needs met in a series of small but timely provisions. In both cases, his fingerprints are visible, but the pathways defy ordinary reasoning. This is why faith is essential. Faith is the bridge between divine intention and human experience, and gentlemen, allowing us to embrace what we cannot explain. When Naaman, the Syrian commander, sought healing from leprosy, he expected a dramatic ritual. Instead, he was told to wash in the Jordan River 7 times. A simple but seemingly ridiculous instruction. His logic resisted it, and gentlemen, but obedience unlocked the miracle. God's answers often bypass conventional systems to prove that the glory belongs to him alone. If the Red Sea had parted because of an unusual wind pattern, it could have been dismissed as coincidence. Gentlemen, if the water in the wilderness had come from digging a well, it could have been explained as resourcefulness. But when the solution is something no human could orchestrate, it becomes a testimony that God alone did it. And gentlemen, this is why he sometimes allows situations to reach a point where human effort can no longer succeed. Gentlemen, Gideon's army was reduced from 32,000 to 300 so that the victory over the Midianites would be recognized as the hand of the Lord. Gentlemen, in the same way, he may strip away human options in your life so that when the breakthrough comes, and that there will be no doubt about its source, it is also important to remember that divine solutions are not random miracles. They are strategic responses tailored to the situation. Jesus fed 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Gentlemen, not because that was the most logical catering plan, but because it was the means by which God would reveal his sufficiency. The method was illogical, and gentlemen, but the result was undeniable. This means that when God gives you an instruction that doesn't make sense to your mind, It may be the very key to your deliverance. Logic may argue, but faith must obey. Peter had been fishing all night without results, gentlemen, and as a professional fisherman, he knew when the conditions were wrong. Yet at the word of Jesus, he let down his nets again and caught a harvest so large the nets began to break. What shifted was not the lake's ecosystem, but the presence of divine authority overriding natural patterns. The illogical nature of God's solutions also serves to humble the proud and elevate the humble. He chose a shepherd boy with no military training to defeat a giant who had intimidated seasoned warriors. Gentlemen, he used the jawbone of a donkey in Samson's hand to strike down an army. These are not the tools or the people human reasoning would have selected, and gentlemen, yet they were the exact instruments God used to accomplish his purposes. This reminds us that when you are facing an impossible challenge, man, you should not limit God to the solutions you can imagine. He may send help from unexpected people through unplanned channels or by means that no one could have predicted. Your responsibility is to remain open, obedient, and sensitive to his leading. Sometimes, and gentlemen, God's solution appears illogical because it works in reverse order from our expectations. We think increase comes by saving more. Yet he may instruct you to give sacrificially, and in doing so, you step into supernatural provision. We think victory comes by fighting harder, yet he may tell you to stand still and see his salvation. We think influence comes by self-promotion, yet he may hide you until the appointed time. Gentlemen, these reversals are part of his way of teaching us that dependence on him is the true foundation for success. It was illogical for Jericho's walls to fall after silent marches and a shout, gentlemen, yet that was the exact strategy that worked because it was God's design. The defiance of logic in God's solutions is not meant to confuse us, but to deepen our trust. When we see him move in ways we could not have planned or predicted, our hearts learn to rest in his sovereignty. Gentlemen, we stop trying to control every outcome and start yielding to his wisdom. Gentlemen, this is why testimonies of God's intervention are often more powerful than explanations. They remind us that the same God who acted before can act again, even if we cannot anticipate the method. So, when his instruction seems strange, when the pathway looks unconventional, and gentlemen, remember that the one giving the direction sees the end from the beginning and has chosen the exact approach that will bring glory to his name and victory to your life. When God promises to visit a person, a family, a city, or a nation, that visitation is tied to a specific moment on his divine calendar. It is not random, it is not haphazard, and it is not driven by human impatience. There is a set time in heaven's agenda when the hand of God will move in a way that changes everything. This is why, no matter how long it may seem to take, his timing is always perfect and cannot be late. From a human perspective, gentlemen, delays feel like denials, but in the realm of God, what we call delay is often preparation. He is not only working on the answer, gentlemen, he is also working on us, shaping our character, increasing our faith, and positioning us to handle the weight of what we are asking for. Gentlemen, if he came before the appointed time, the blessing could crush us instead of lift us. His wisdom ensures that when the visitation comes, it will bring life and not destruction. The scriptures are full of examples where the set time for God's visitation brought fulfillment after long seasons of waiting. Sarah waited 25 years from the time of the promise until she held Isaac in her arms. But the Bible says, who at the set time which God had spoken, she conceived. The Israelites were told they would be in captivity for 400 years. And though the suffering was great, and gentlemen, the visitation did not happen in the 300th year or the 390th year. It happened at the exact moment God ordained. This means that his timing is not influenced by panic or pressure. It is anchored in his eternal plan. Just as the sun rises and sets at fixed hours, gentlemen, so the move of God in your life has a divinely appointed moment that nothing can delay and nothing can hasten beyond his will. The set time of God's visitation is also linked to alignment with his purposes. Gentlemen, sometimes what seems like a delay is actually God waiting for certain pieces to come together. In the case of Joseph, gentlemen, the dream was given early in his life, but it was not fulfilled until years later, after he had been sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. Gentlemen, the timing of his release from prison was orchestrated so that it coincided with Pharaoh's dream, creating the perfect opening for Joseph to step into his destiny. If Joseph had been released earlier, the opportunity might not have been there. If he had been released later, someone else might have taken the position. And gentlemen, this shows that God's set time is not just about our readiness, but also about the alignment of circumstances in the world around us. He arranges events in such a way that his visitation achieves maximum impact for his glory and for our good. Waiting for God's set time is one of the greatest tests of faith. It is in the waiting that impatience whispers lies, suggesting that God has forgotten or that we must take matters into our own hands. Abraham and Sarah's attempt to produce Ishmael is a clear example of what happens when we try to force God's promise ahead of schedule. The result is a complication, not a solution. Yet even in our mistakes, God's mercy remains and his appointed time still stands. The enemy tries to use the waiting season to sow doubt, but faith must cling to the truth that the one who promised is faithful. The delay does not mean God is idle, gentlemen. It means he is ensuring that the appointed moment will accomplish everything he intended. The perfect timing of God's visitation also reveals his authority over all things. And gentlemen, kings, rulers, systems, and even the forces of nature must bow to his timing. When Jesus came to earth, it was said to be in the fullness of time. The political, cultural, and spiritual climate was all arranged for his arrival. Likewise, in our personal lives, there is a fullness of time when everything is set in place for the breakthrough to manifest. Until then, we may not understand why certain doors remain closed or why certain prayers seem unanswered. But when the time comes, the speed and precision of God's action will make it clear why the wait was necessary. Often, when the visitation finally happens, and gentlemen, the magnitude of what God does makes us forget the pain of the delay. It is also important to see that God's set time is not subject to earthly calendars or deadlines. He is not bound by fiscal years, school terms, or human schedules. He can bring a turnaround in the middle of a crisis, a promotion when the economy is collapsing, or a healing when the doctors have given up. Because his timing flows from eternity. It cannot be early and it cannot be late. It is always exactly when it should be. This is why the psalmist could declare, "You will arise and have mercy on Zion for the time to favor her." Yes, the set time has come. When that moment arrives, what was impossible yesterday becomes possible today. Understanding that God's visitation has a set time should produce patience and confidence in the believer. Gentlemen, it should remove the desperation that leads to compromise and replace it with the peace that comes from trusting his sovereignty. Farmers understand this principle no matter how much they want the harvest. And gentlemen, they cannot reap in the second month what is designed to mature in the fifth. They water, they protect, they weed, but they wait because the seed has its own appointed time to bear fruit. In the same way, the promises of God in your life have their own season of manifestation, and your role is to remain steadfast in faith, obey his instructions, gentlemen, and prepare for the day when heaven's clock strikes your hour. When that set time arrives, the visitation will be unstoppable. And gentlemen, the forces that resisted you will have no choice but to yield. The resources you need will flow without struggle. Gentlemen, the people assigned to help you will appear. The favor that seemed withheld will be poured out in abundance. Gentlemen, you will look back and understand that the waiting was not wasted. It was a divine process that ensured you were ready and the environment was prepared. And in that moment, you will see that his timing was not only perfect, but also necessary for the fullness of his purpose to be revealed in your life. When God steps into a situation, there is no level of decay, destruction, or loss that is too far gone for him to restore. Gentlemen, his power is not intimidated by how long something has been broken, how deep the wounds go, or how irreversible the damage appears to be. Gentlemen, the God who created life from dust and breathed into Adam to make him a living soul is the same God who can breathe into any circumstance and bring it back to life. In his hands, nothing is beyond redemption. What men declare finished, he calls a beginning. What the world labels hopeless, he names a testimony in progress. Redemption is not just about forgiveness of sins. It is also about the restoration of destinies, opportunities, relationships, and purposes that seem lost forever in the valley of dry bones described in Ezekiel's vision. Gentlemen, the bones were not just dead, they were very dry, signifying a situation that had been lifeless for a long time. Gentlemen, yet when the word of the Lord came and the breath of God entered, the bones came together, flesh covered them, and they stood as a mighty army. Okay, gentlemen, this is the nature of God's redemptive power. It does not matter how fragmented, scattered, or lifeless something is, His Spirit can gather it and reframe it and revive it until it fulfills His original intent. Human logic would say that once bones are dry, the story is over. But heaven's reality says that as long as God is involved, there is no such thing as too late. This truth is vividly seen in the story of Lazarus. Gentlemen, by the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days and his body had already begun to decay. To everyone around, the matter was closed. They had moved from hope to mourning. Yet Jesus stood before the tomb and declared, "Lazarus, man, come forth." That command carried the creative power to reverse death, restore breath, and bring back what was gone. When God redeems, He does not just repair, He resurrects. He brings life where there was none, and does so in a way that removes all doubt about the source of the miracle. The stench of death was replaced by the fragrance of life, because nothing is beyond His reach in our own lives. Gentlemen, there are areas that can resemble the valley of dry bones or the tomb of Lazarus. It might be a dream we abandoned years ago, and gentlemen, a calling we thought we disqualified ourselves from, a relationship that broke beyond reconciliation, or a season of joy stolen by pain and disappointment. We may have buried those hopes, convinced they could never return, but the breath of God can enter those very places, awakening what seemed permanently lost. His redemption goes deeper than surface restoration. Gentlemen, He rebuilds from the ground up, turning ashes into beauty and shame into glory. This is why surrender is so powerful. When we place the ruins of our lives into His hands, gentlemen, He can do more with them than we ever could with our best efforts. It is important to understand that nothing being beyond redemption does not mean God simply erases the past. Instead, He transforms it. The failures, losses, and wounds that once brought pain become part of the testimony of His grace. Gentlemen, Joseph's years of betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment were not undone, but they were redeemed into a platform for influence and preservation. What was meant for evil became the very pathway to fulfill His God-given assignment. Gentlemen, this is how redemption works. It does not ignore the reality of what happened, gentlemen, but it reframes it in light of God's power to bring good out of what was intended for harm. There are times when redemption comes in a way that surpasses the original state. Job lost everything, yet when God restored him, it was with twice as much as he had before. This shows that God's breath does not only revive to the starting point, but can elevate beyond it. In His hands, gentlemen, the end of a thing can be better than its beginning. This is why believers must never resign themselves to hopelessness, gentlemen, because hopelessness denies the nature of the God who specializes in making all things new. As long as His Spirit is still moving, the story can change. One of the greatest obstacles to believing that nothing is beyond redemption is the weight of time. The longer a situation has been dead, the harder it is to imagine it living again. But God is not subject to time. He is the Alpha and the Omega, present in the past, present, and future all at once. He can step into a lost season and recover what was stolen as though no time had passed. He can bring back opportunities we thought were gone forever, or open new ones that compensate for what we missed. Time may limit us, but it cannot limit Him. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Yet when they entered the promised land, God gave them victory after victory. Gentlemen, redeeming the years of delay with a swift fulfillment of His promise, believing that nothing is beyond redemption, also requires us to release our own definitions of what redemption should look like. Man, sometimes God revives exactly what was lost. Other times, He gives something entirely new that fulfills the same or greater purpose. Either way, His plan is always better. And gentlemen, the key is to trust that He knows how to breathe life into our circumstances in the way that will bring the most glory to His name and the most good to our destiny. What He redeems, He sustains, and what He sources as a testimony for generations to come. When His breath comes, there is no enemy too strong, no damage too severe and no loss too deep to withstand it. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in those who believe. Meaning resurrection power is not a distant concept but a present reality. This power can heal the most broken hearts, restore the most shattered dreams, and revive the most hopeless situations. It reminds us that in God's kingdom, death is not final and loss is not permanent. Every tomb can become a testimony, every valley can become a place of victory. And gentlemen, and every ending can become the beginning of a story that only He could write. When God moves, He does not always follow a gradual process. Gentlemen, there are moments in His dealings with men when change happens instantly, without warning and without the limitations of natural progression. Gentlemen, years of pain, delay, loss, or stagnation can be overturned in a single act of divine intervention. This is the nature of sudden shifts. They are moments when heaven touches earth with such force that the trajectory of a life, family, gentlemen, or even a nation changes permanently. One encounter, one divine word, one opening of a door can bring an end to struggles that have lasted for decades. These moments are not accidents, gentlemen. They are the manifestation of God's power and mercy breaking into time with supernatural speed. The scriptures are filled with accounts of such shifts. In Acts 12, Peter was chained between two soldiers, guarded by 4 squads, with iron gates sealing his fate by every human measure. Gentlemen, his execution was certain. Yet in the night, an angel of the Lord entered the prison, struck him on the side, and commanded him to rise quickly. And gentlemen, the chains fell off, the guards were bypassed, and the iron gate opened of its own accord. And gentlemen, what was a hopeless situation turned into freedom within minutes. This is the kind of turnaround only God can orchestrate. One that defies protocol, bypasses systems, and renders the opposition powerless. When He acts, there is no committee that must approve it, no delay that can resist it, and no enemy that can prevent it. A sudden shift is not merely about speed, it is about transformation. And gentlemen, it is when God takes what the enemy meant for evil and flips it so completely that the former pain becomes the very foundation of the testimony. Joseph's journey from the prison to the palace happened in a single day. He woke up a prisoner, yet before the sun set, he was the second most powerful man in Egypt. Years of betrayal, slavery, and confinement were reversed in one divine promotion. Gentlemen, such shifts remind us that God does not need equal time to counter the years of loss. His one moment of favor can outweigh a lifetime of struggle. Gentlemen, what took the enemy years to build against you can crumble in seconds under the weight of His decree. These moments often come unexpectedly to human eyes, gentlemen, but they are never random to God. A sudden shift is the visible eruption of a plan He has been aligning quietly in the background. Gentlemen, while Joseph was enduring his trials, God was positioning Pharaoh to have a dream only Joseph could interpret. While the woman with the issue of blood was suffering for 12 years, God was ordering her step to intersect with Jesus at the exact moment of His passing. While the layman sat at the beautiful gate daily, gentlemen, God was preparing the apostles to be filled with the Spirit so that when they met Him, one word and one touch would change his life forever. Gentlemen, the suddenness of the shift is only sudden to us in heaven's timeline. It is right on schedule. The nature of God's sudden interventions teaches us to never give up, even when the night seems longest. At midnight, Paul and Silas were bound in prison, yet as they prayed and sang hymns, a great earthquake shook the foundations of the jail. Every door flew open and everyone's chains fell off. There was no gradual loosening of the bonds. Freedom came instantly. This pattern repeats throughout scripture. And gentlemen, Jericho's walls did not crumble brick by brick. They fell flat at the sound of a shout. The Red Sea did not recede over hours. When it parted at once, when Moses stretched out his hand, blind Bartimaeus did not regain sight slowly. His eyes were opened in a moment when Jesus spoke to men. These examples reveal that divine timing is not always about gradual change. It is often about appointed moments that bring total transformation instantly. However, sudden shifts do not mean sudden preparation. The moment may happen instantly, but the preparation often spans years. Gentlemen, David's victory over Goliath was swift, but it was built on years of training in the fields with lions and bears. When the shift came, he was ready to step into it. This is why seasons of waiting are not wasted. They are equipping us to handle the weight of what God will release in an instant. When the door swings open, you must be ready to walk through it without hesitation or fear. Then those who are faithful in obscurity are best positioned to handle the spotlight. When God brings them into it, suddenly sudden shifts are also a weapon God uses to display his sovereignty and silence the voices of doubt. When change is gradual, people can attribute it to personal effort, luck, or human help. But when it is instant and undeniable, the only explanation is that God intervened. This is why he sometimes allows situations to become so impossible that when the shift comes, no one can question the source. The Egyptian army could not claim the Red Sea parting was a trick. Gentlemen, the suddenness and completeness of the miracle left them no room to doubt. In the same way, when God turns your captivity, those who see it will say, the Lord has done great things. For the believer, this truth should ignite hope in every season, no matter how long the pain has lasted. Gentlemen, you are never more than one moment away from a complete turnaround. The phone call that changes your career, the diagnosis that reverses overnight, the reconciliation that happens in a single conversation. Gentlemen, the opportunity that appears without prior warning. All of these are ways God manifests his ability to end years of struggle in a moment. And when it happens, it will not be fragile or temporary. What he does suddenly, gentlemen, he sustains by his power, living with the awareness that sudden shifts are possible, changes the way you endure hard seasons. It keeps your faith alive, and gentlemen, your spirit expectant and your heart ready. You understand that God does not need a long time to change your situation. He only needs the right time. And when that time comes, the speed and magnitude of what he does will erase the pain of the years that came before, replacing them with the joy and strength of a testimony. Only he could write. Faith is more than a mental agreement with what God has said. It is a deep, gentlemen, unwavering confidence that he is both able and willing to fulfill his word, even when every visible circumstance argues otherwise. Gentlemen, faith does not simply wait for something to happen. It actively positions the heart and life to receive what God has promised. It is the invisible magnet that draws the attention of heaven, the unseen currency that transactions in the spirit realm are made with. Without faith, and gentlemen, the scripture says it is impossible to please God, but with faith, ordinary people become candidates for extraordinary encounters. Faith is not passive wishful thinking. It is persistent belief that shapes decisions, conversations, and expectations until the answer manifests. The Bible reveals again and again that God responds to faith. Gentlemen, Jesus often paused in the middle of his journeys to meet those whose faith could not be ignored. Blind Bartimaeus cried out from the roadside, refusing to be silenced by the crowd, until Jesus stopped and called him forward. The centurion, who understood authority, and gentlemen, believed that a single word from Jesus was enough to heal his servant, and the Lord marveled at his faith. Gentlemen, the woman with the issue of blood pressed through the crowd, believing that even touching the hem of his garment would make her whole, and her persistent expectation drew virtue out of him before he even addressed her. In each case, faith was not hidden. It was demonstrated in action. Urgency and refusal to be discouraged. Persistent faith attracts divine attention because it mirrors the nature of God himself. He is constant, unchanging, and faithful, and when he sees his children holding fast to his promises with the same constancy, it delights him. Faith says, and gentlemen, I will not let go until you bless me. Just as Jacob wrestled through the night and would not release the angel of the Lord until the blessing came. Gentlemen, such persistence is not arrogance. It is alignment with the reality that God's promises are sure and his nature is trustworthy. And gentlemen, it is the difference between those who pray once and walk away disappointed and those who keep knocking until the door is opened. This kind of faith also refuses to be defined by delays. Abraham waited 25 years for the promise of Isaac, yet the Bible records that he did not waver in unbelief, but was strengthened in faith. And gentlemen, giving glory to God, delay can make some people doubt, but for the person anchored in faith, delay becomes a deeper root system for belief. Faith thrives in the unseen, for it is the evidence of things not seen. A farmer does not see the seed under the soil, but he waters it because he knows it will grow. In the same way, persistent faith waters the seed of God's promise with prayer, thanksgiving, and expectation until it springs forth. Faith that attracts God's attention is not just verbal, it is visible in behavior. Noah did not simply believe rain was coming. He built an ark for years without seeing a single drop. His faith became a physical reality long before the promise was fulfilled. Likewise, gentlemen, Joshua and the Israelites marched around Jericho for 6 days in silence, not because they had proof the walls would fall, and gentlemen, but because they believed the word God had given. Faith acts as though the answer is certain, even if the natural evidence says otherwise. This kind of action is a prophetic statement to both heaven and earth. Gentlemen, I believe what God has said more than what my eyes can see. Another dimension of faith is that it creates an atmosphere where miracles can happen. In Mark 6, when Jesus came to his own hometown, he could not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Lack of faith shuts the door to divine intervention, while an atmosphere of faith invites the supernatural. This is why Jesus often told those he healed, gentlemen, your faith has made you well. It was not that faith alone healed them, but that faith connected them to the power and willingness of God to heal. Faith opens the channel through which grace flows, and without it, that channel remains blocked. Persistent belief also refuses to be intimidated by impossibilities. Faith sees the Red Sea and still moves forward because God said, go. It sees the giant and still runs to the battle line because God has delivered before. It sees the empty nets and still casts them again because the master gave the word. Faith does not deny the facts. It simply believes the truth of God's word is greater than the facts. This is why Jesus told Jairus when news came that his daughter had died, do not be afraid, only believe. Fear tries to choke faith, but faith chooses to fix its gaze on the one who holds all power. The persistence of faith is also revealed in prayer. And gentlemen, Jesus gave the parable of the persistent widow who kept coming to the unjust judge until he granted her request, not because he cared about justice, gentlemen, but because of her continual coming. If persistence moves even an unjust man, how much more will it move the heart of a righteous and loving Father? Faith prays until something happens, not in vain repetition, but in confident expectation that the answer will come. It knows that the spiritual realm is not idle, and that every prayer of faith is accomplishing something even before it is visible. The beauty of faith is that it honors God, and in turn, gentlemen, God honors it. When faith is genuine, it shifts the spiritual atmosphere around a person. Others may see only a desperate situation, gentlemen, but God sees a vessel ready for his intervention. This is why he often moves suddenly in the lives of those who have remained steadfast, as if to say, your faith has reached heaven. It becomes a testimony not only to the one who receives the answer, but to everyone watching. Gentlemen, that God is faithful to those who trust him without wavering. Living with persistent belief and expectation is not always easy in a world that demands visible proof before acting. But the life of faith is one that takes God at his word, builds the ark before the rain, digs the ditches before the water comes, and prepares the nets before the fish arrive. It is a life that stays positioned, ready and expectant. And gentlemen, knowing that the God who sees faith will always respond in his perfect way and time, every trial carries within it the potential to become a testimony when God steps into the situation. The pain, the pressure, and the waiting may feel unbearable while you are in it, but nothing is wasted in the hands of a God who redeems stories for his glory. What begins as a season of struggle can be transformed into a platform of victory. And gentlemen, not only for your encouragement, but as a public display of his power and faithfulness. Tests are not meant to destroy you. Gentlemen, they are often divine setups for a greater revelation of who God is and what he can do. When his visitation comes, it does not merely remove the problem. And gentlemen, it leaves a mark that others can see, a story that points directly back to him. Throughout scripture, we see examples of this truth. And Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace was filled with betrayal, false accusations, and years of imprisonment. And gentlemen, but when God's appointed time arrived, the very trial that seemed to bury him became the testimony that saved nations. Gentlemen, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den not because of wrongdoing, but because of his unwavering devotion to God. Men, what could have been his end became the very moment God displayed his power by shutting the mouths of the lions. Gentlemen, turning Daniel's test into a testimony that made a pagan king acknowledge the living God. In both cases, Gentlemen, the trial became the stage for God's glory to be revealed. One of the most powerful things about God turning a test into a testimony is that he often does it in a way that is undeniable. When Lazarus was raised from the dead, it was not done quietly or in secret. And gentlemen, the miracle was so public that it drew crowds and caused many to believe in Jesus. Your testimony is not meant to be hidden. It is a light that reveals God's hand at work. This is why sometimes God allows the process to seem longer than you expected, not to punish you, but to make the outcome so visible and so beyond human ability that everyone knows it was his doing. Tests often bring out what is truly in our hearts. Gentlemen, they reveal the depth of our faith, the strength of our trust, and the purity of our motives. In the moment, this refining process can be painful, but it is also part of how God prepares you to carry the testimony well. A testimony is not just about a good ending. It is about the journey of transformation that happens along the way. It is about how your faith matured, how your character deepened, gentlemen, and how your intimacy with God grew in the waiting. By the time the answer comes, you are not just someone who survived. Gentlemen, you are someone who has been shaped into a living witness of his power. When God turns your test into a testimony, and gentlemen, it does more than encourage you personally. It strengthens the faith of those who hear it. The psalmist declares, I will tell of the goodness of the Lord, because testimonies are seeds of faith for others. Hearing how God healed, provided, delivered, and gentlemen, or restored you ignites hope in those who are still in their own trials. Your story becomes proof that God is still active, still attentive, gentlemen, and still able to do the impossible. This is why your testimony is not just for you, it is for the many lives it will touch. Sometimes the test is so overwhelming that it feels like the end of your story. But with God, the test is often the middle chapter, not the final page. The enemy may intend it for evil, and gentlemen, but God has a way of rewriting the script so that the very thing meant to destroy you becomes the evidence of his saving power. Job's life is a perfect example. He lost everything, endured unimaginable pain, and yet after his visitation from God, gentlemen, his latter days were more blessed than his beginning. His story still speaks today as a testimony of endurance, restoration, and divine faithfulness. Your role in the process is to remain steadfast even when the outcome is not yet visible. Tests are temporary, but testimonies can last for generations. Faith in the middle of the storm says, I may not understand how, but I trust that God will use even this for his glory. That posture of trust invites God's power to manifest in ways that defy explanation. Gentlemen, and when the breakthrough comes, you will see that every tear, every prayer, and every act of obedience was worth it. And gentlemen, because the testimony will be far greater than the pain of the process, a testimony born out of a test carries a special weight because it is not theory. It is lived experience. It is one thing to read about God's faithfulness, but it is another to say, gentlemen, I have seen it for myself. That personal encounter changes how you worship, how you pray, and how you encourage others. Gentlemen, it deepens your gratitude and strengthens your resolve because you know firsthand that nothing is impossible for God. Gentlemen, it also builds an unshakable faith that will sustain you in future challenges because the memory of his past faithfulness becomes the anchor for your present hope. In the end, what began as a painful chapter will become a story you gladly tell, not because of the hardship itself, and gentlemen, but because of how God's hand was revealed through it. Others will see the transformation and be drawn to the God who turned it all around. And your life becomes a living testimony, a public display of his power, and a reminder that no matter how fierce the test, the one who holds your story has already written the victory.